In today's video, we dive into a powerful story of growth and self-reflection. Clara, an office worker, makes a quick judgment about a MAGA hat-wearing visitor, only to learn a life-changing lesson about empathy and understanding. Stay tuned as we explore how one moment of change can alter perspectives for the better. The corporate office buzzed with activity as employees filed in for their workday. It was an ordinary Thursday morning, and the hum of early morning chatter filled the halls. Clara, a young and confident office worker, was already seated at her desk, coffee in hand, glancing through emails. She was known for her quick wit, sharp tongue, and sometimes bold opinions. Her colleagues both admired and, at times, feared her frankness. For Clara, work was more than just completing tasks. It was a space where she felt in control, where her words and opinions held weight. Another busy day ahead, Clara muttered to herself, looking over the schedule for the day, meeting with a client, filing paperwork, and preparing reports. Just another day in the office. Her eyes were already scanning for any potential distractions, something to break the monotony. As she adjusted her seat and opened her inbox, a figure appeared in the reception area, a man in his late 40s, dressed in a well-tailored suit. But it was the red "Make America Great Again" MAGA hat perched atop his head that immediately caught Clara's attention. She stiffened for a moment. The man was older than most of the usual office visitors, but it was the hat that made her uneasy. Clara had never hidden her disdain for the symbol of division that the hat represented. Her politics were progressive, leaning heavily towards social justice causes, diversity, and equality. She had no tolerance for anything that appeared to contradict those beliefs. As the man entered the lobby, Clara's sharp eyes followed his every move. He looked around the reception area, adjusting his hat as he surveyed the space. For a moment, it seemed as though he was trying to find someone. Perhaps he was meeting with the CEO or one of the senior executives. Clara leaned back in her chair and took a long sip of her coffee, ready to mentally prepare herself for whatever confrontation was about to unfold. Clara wasn't a fan of confrontation, but she wasn't afraid of it either. Her bluntness often got her into trouble, especially when it came to matters of politics. She had no problem calling people out when they wore their political beliefs like badges of honor, and she felt that the MAGA hat symbolized everything wrong with the current political climate. Without thinking, Clara muttered under her breath, loud enough for a few co-workers nearby to hear, "Great, here we go again." Another one of those types who think they're going to change the world with their misguided hats. Her co-workers, familiar with Clara's tendencies, exchanged glances. Some smiled, while others shook their heads, knowing full well that Clara would likely say something about the man's hat. She never could resist the temptation to comment when someone's appearance didn't align with her views. The man, seemingly oblivious to the hushed remark, continued toward the office manager's private meeting room. As he passed Clara's desk, she couldn't help herself. She had to make her opinion known, and what better time than now? "Hey, nice hat," Clara called out sarcastically, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Does it come with a free 'I'm completely out of touch with reality' sticker?" The man's steps faltered for a second, but he quickly regained his composure, walking past Clara without acknowledging her. Clara leaned back in her chair, a self-satisfied grin forming on her face. She had made her point, and judging by the slight chuckle from her co-workers, they were all in on it. It felt good, in fact. Clara went back to her work, not giving the encounter another thought. After all, she was just speaking her truth, wasn't she? But in the back of her mind, she couldn't help but wonder who this person was, and why he had come to the office with such a noticeable, controversial hat. She had grown used to seeing people with differing political views, but this felt different. Something about the man's quiet demeanor struck her as odd. He wasn't aggressive or loud. In fact, he seemed rather calm. But Clara's mind quickly dismissed the thought. If he was going to represent such divisive views, he had to be a person of privilege, someone who couldn't relate to the struggles of others. The morning wore on, and Clara quickly got lost in her work. The hum of the office continued around her, and her brief interaction with the man in the MAGA hat seemed like a distant memory. There was a meeting in 30 minutes that she had to prepare for, so she focused on her computer screen and shut out the noise around her. Little did Clara know, that encounter with the man in the MAGA how it soon come back to haunt her in a way she never could have imagined. As the day progressed, Clara continued her tasks, unaware of the conversation happening behind closed doors. The man in the MAGA hat, now revealed to be the prospective beer for the company, had just met with the CEO to discuss an acquisition deal. The discussions were crucial, and as the beer's representative, Clara's CEO was eager to seal the deal. But Clara wasn't aware of these high-stakes negotiations, as she was still focusing on her mundane office tasks. Her day was interrupted when the receptionist knocked gently on her door. "Clara, the CEO wants to see you in the conference room right now," the receptionist said with a hint of urgency in her voice. Clara frowned, but didn't question it. She had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. When Clara entered the conference room, she was surprised to find the man in the MAGA hat sitting at the table with the CEO. The conversation immediately shifted, and she quickly realized this man was not just some random visitor. He wasn't just any potential customer, he was a potential investor. In fact, he was the one who had just made an offer to buy the company. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. The man she had mocked was now the one who would determine the future of the company she worked for. The absurdity of the situation stunned Clara, leaving her speechless. As she took a seat, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She had no idea how to navigate this awkward moment. Alan Foster, the man she had ridiculed earlier, looked at Clara with a slight smile, as if he knew exactly what had been going through her mind. "Well, Clara," he said calmly, "I'm glad to see the team is as passionate as always. But I think we need to talk about your behavior in the office today. It's important that we all maintain a sense of professionalism, especially when it comes to business interactions." Clara could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she kept her composure. The weight of the moment was becoming overwhelming. How could she have been so careless? She had made an assumption based on something as trivial as a hat, and now she had to face the consequences. This wasn't just about a political statement anymore. It was about her actions and her understanding of others. She hadn't seen beyond the surface of Alan Foster. She hadn't considered who he was or what his impact might be. Alan Foster leaned forward slightly, offering a reassuring but firm tone. "I believe everyone here has something valuable to contribute, and I hope this is a learning experience for all of us. I'm not here to punish anyone, but rather to help this company grow." The room was silent as Clara sat in her seat, taking in his words. As the words of Alan Foster hung in the air, Clara felt the weight of her own embarrassment settle in. She hadn't anticipated that the man she had so freely mocked was about to change the trajectory of her professional life. It was one of those moments that would linger in her memory for years to come, a stark reminder of how easily assumptions can lead to irreversible consequences. The silence in the room was thick, suffocating. Clara's palms were clammy, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the edge of her blouse. She tried to focus, to collect herself, but her thoughts were racing. How had this happened? She wondered. How could I have been so ignorant? Alan Foster continued, his voice calm yet unwavering. "Clara, I know you probably didn't mean any harm with your comments this morning, but as a professional, we need to respect the people we work with, no matter what they wear or what opinions they hold. The MAGA hat is a symbol to some, but it doesn't define the man who wears it." Clara swallowed hard, her throat dry. She hadn't expected this. She had assumed that Alan was just another rich businessman who wouldn't care about the struggles of people like her. But here he was calm, measured, and incredibly understanding. His words stung, and she knew she had made a mistake that could cost her dearly. Sitting across from her, Alan looked at Clara with a quiet understanding, as if he knew exactly what was going through her mind. His expression remained unchanged, but there was something about the way he held himself that demanded respect. This wasn't a man who got upset over trivial matters. Instead, he seemed to embody an air of wisdom and experience. "You're right," Clara finally spoke, her voice faltering at first. She looked down at her hands, gathering her thoughts before looking back up at Alan. I shouldn't have said what I did. It was inappropriate, and I let my own biases cloud my judgment. I was wrong." There was a pause, and Clara could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed louder than ever. It felt like the room was closing in around her, but she couldn't look away from Alan's steady gaze. Alan Foster nodded slowly, his face softening. We all make mistakes, Clara, but it's how we learn from them that matters. It's important to remember that everyone comes to the table with their own experiences, their own beliefs. The least we can do is listen and understand before making judgments. The words hit Clara harder than she expected. She wasn't used to hearing people speak with such calm authority, especially when she knew she had wronged them. It made her feel small, but in a way, it also gave her a sense of clarity she hadn't had before. She felt like a child being scolded, but in the best possible way. It was a strange feeling, one that she hadn't experienced before. She had always prided herself on being unapologetically outspoken. She had grown used to being the one who spoke her mind, who didn't back down from what she believed. But now, in this moment, she realized how important it was to be open to other perspectives, to set aside her preconceived notions and truly listen. Alan took a deep breath, his posture relaxed but his eyes firm. I've always believed that a company is more than just a business, it's a community. It's a place where people come together, no matter their background, their political views, or their personal beliefs. And it's about creating a space where everyone feels respected, heard, and valued. Clara felt her chest tighten. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear that. The words seemed to cut through the confusion in her mind, helping her understand something she had never considered before. The workplace, the community, the world. It wasn't just about pushing her own views onto others. It was about understanding, about finding common ground despite differences. Her gaze shifted down to the desk, the feeling of guilt creeping into her chest. She couldn't help but think about her coworkers, about the judgment she had passed on them in the past. There had been times when she had dismissed someone simply because they didn't share her political views, or because they wore something she found offensive. And now, sitting here in this conference room, she realized how wrong she had been. Alan's voice brought her back to the present. Clara, the reason I'm having this conversation with you is because I want you to grow. I see potential in you. You've been a valuable member of this team, and I believe you can continue to contribute to this company in meaningful ways. But that requires understanding, humility, and respect. Clara nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. She had always believed that she was doing the right thing, speaking up for what she thought was important. But now, she realized how often she had let her own ego get in the way. She had been quick to judge, quick to assume, and now she had to face the consequences. I'll do better, she said quietly, the sincerity in her voice surprising even herself. I promise I will. I'll listen more. I'll be open to others' views, even if they're different from my own. Alan smiled, a small, encouraging smile that made Clara feel a sense of relief she hadn't expected. I know you will. We all have room to grow, and we can always learn from our mistakes, as long as we're willing to look at ourselves honestly and take responsibility for our actions. Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude toward him. It was rare to find someone who could speak with such authority, while also showing understanding and empathy. She had expected him to be angry, to reprimand her harshly for her words. Instead, he had shown her a path toward growth, a path she had never considered before. As Clara left the conference room, her mind was swirling with thoughts. She had made a mistake, one that could have been avoided if she had just taken a moment to understand the person in front of her. But now, she had learned something invaluable. It wasn't enough to simply be right. It was about how you treated others, how you showed respect, and how you could make a difference in someone's life by listening and understanding. She returned to her desk, but the atmosphere around her felt different. The usual office noise was still present, but it was quieter now. Clara sat in her chair, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. But her thoughts were far away. She was reflecting on everything she had learned, everything she had seen in Alan's actions and words. This wasn't just about the MAGA hat or her own political beliefs. It was about being human, about connecting with others in a way that transcended politics and opinion. For the first time in a long while, Clara felt humbled. And in that moment, she knew that this was just the beginning of her journey toward becoming the person she had always aspired to be, someone who listened, someone who understood, and someone who respected others. no matter where they came from or what they believed. The day after her conversation with Alan, Clara arrived at the office with a heavy but hopeful heart. She had spent much of the evening reflecting on their discussion, replaying his words in her mind. She wasn't expecting an immediate transformation, but she knew she had taken the first step toward something better. Her desire to grow as a person had ignited a new sense of awareness in her, one that made her determined to change, even if it meant confronting the parts of herself she didn't like. Clara sat at her desk, the usual hum of the office around her, but today it felt different. She felt more attuned to the energy of the space, more aware of the small moments. Her eyes drifted to her colleagues, some focused on their work, others chatting casually. There were the familiar faces of her team, each with their own set of opinions, experiences, and histories. Clara had always seen them as colleagues, people with whom she simply worked. But now she saw them differently. She was beginning to understand that there was more to every interaction than what met the eye. As Clara sipped her coffee and stared at her computer screen, a message popped up on her inbox. It was from Grace, her colleague who had witnessed the exchange between Clara and Alan in the meeting the previous day. Clara had been too flustered after their talk to really process the weight of Grace's gaze. Grace had always been someone Clara respected, someone who seemed to carry an air of calmness and professionalism that Clara often envied. The message was simple. Can we talk later? I've got something I want to share with you. Clara's heart skipped a beat. What could Grace possibly want to talk about? Had the conversation from yesterday affected her too? Clara's mind started racing with possibilities, all of them ending in embarrassment or some kind of confrontation. But Clara was determined. She had decided that she was going to confront her own biases and be open to learning from those around her. She wasn't going to shrink from difficult conversations anymore. With a deep breath, Clara quickly responded, agreeing to meet after work. The clock seemed to move at a snail's pace as the day dragged on. Clara found herself constantly looking up at Grace's desk, wondering what was going on in her colleague's mind, as much as she tried to focus on her work. Her thoughts kept returning to the conversation they were about to have. She couldn't deny the anxiety building in her chest, but she had made a promise to herself, and she was going to keep it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the workday came to an end. Grace approached Clara's desk, her expression unreadable. Clara stood up, offering a nervous smile, and they walked together toward the break room, a quieter space where they could talk privately. Grace waited until they were seated before she spoke. Clara, I've been thinking a lot about what happened yesterday, and I wanted to say don't take this the wrong way, but I think you really missed an opportunity with Alan. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, one that Clara couldn't quite place. Clara's heart sank. She had known this moment was coming, but she didn't expect it to feel so uncomfortable. I know, Clara stammered, trying to hold back the wave of shame that threatened to overwhelm her. I really messed up, didn't I? Grace nodded, her gaze unwavering. Yes, but you're not the first person to do so. And the thing is, it wasn't just about what you said to Alan, it's about how you acted afterward. You could have learned something from him, from the way he handled it. Clara felt the sting of Grace's words, but deep down, she knew Grace was right. She had let her emotions get the best of her in the moment, her assumptions clouding her judgment. She had allowed the MAGA hat to become a symbol of something negative, instead of stepping back and seeing the person wearing it. Alan had been calm and understanding, something Clara had not been able to replicate. She had judged, and she had done so quickly. I didn't give him the chance to explain. I just assumed. I assumed he was just some businessman who didn't care about people like me. Clara admitted, the words coming out more easily than she had anticipated. But he wasn't like that, was he? Grace shook her head. No, Clara. Alan's been a major contributor to this company for years. He's a quiet investor, but he believes in making a difference. And to be honest, I don't think I would have had the same conversation with you if I hadn't seen how you reacted in that meeting. You're someone who wants to make a difference too, but you need to be more open-minded. Your views are valid, but they're not the only ones. Clara took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had been so focused on her own views that she hadn't given enough room for others to share theirs. It was a humbling realization, one that made her feel a bit smaller, but also more grounded. She wasn't perfect, and she didn't expect to be, but she did want to become someone who could engage with the world in a more open and compassionate way. I understand, and I'm sorry for how I acted yesterday, Clara said softly, meeting Grace's gaze. I know I need to do better, and I want to. I don't want to be the person who judges others before really getting to know them. Grace smiled, her expression softening. That's all anyone can ask for. Clara, just remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to listen, to understand, and to grow. Clara nodded, feeling the weight of Grace's words sink in. She knew it was going to take time. Change wasn't something that happened overnight. But this was the first step in the right direction. She had always prided herself on being an advocate for fairness. But now she had to learn how to apply that to everyone, even those whose opinions didn't align with hers. As the conversation wrapped up, Clara felt a sense of relief wash over her. Grace's words were the guidance she needed, the push that would keep her moving forward. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was the beginning of something more meaningful. She wasn't alone in this. Grace had given her the encouragement she needed to confront her biases and start fresh. When Clara returned to her desk, she found herself reflecting on the experience. She had learned a valuable lesson about humility and the importance of keeping an open mind. She had expected to face criticism, but instead, she had received the opportunity to grow. And while the road ahead wouldn't be easy, she was ready to continue the journey, knowing that change started with one small step. Clara woke up the next morning with the weight of her realization still heavy in her mind. The events of the previous day had left her feeling both humbled and conflicted. Her conversation with Grace had opened her eyes, but now she was left with the challenge of translating those lessons into action. How could she move forward knowing the biases that had clouded her judgment? She knew that she couldn't simply dismiss what had happened and hope that it would go away. This wasn't just about apologizing to Alan, as Grace had suggested. This was about confronting the larger issue, the way she had allowed her assumptions about others to dictate her actions. It was an uncomfortable truth, but one that had to be faced if she wanted to truly change. As Claire prepared for work, she couldn't help but reflect on the subtle ways in which bias had shaped her interactions in the past. She had been a passionate advocate for equality, but had she truly walked the talk? Or had she allowed her personal beliefs to overshadow her capacity for understanding others? Her own actions had betrayed her principles, and it was time to take accountability for that. Clara had always prided herself on being an empathetic person, on trying to see the world from others' perspectives. But her own discomfort with Alan's MAGA hat had clouded that ability. It wasn't about the hat, it was about what it represented. But in her rush to judge, she had never stopped to think about who Alan really was or what his story was. It was a painful realization, but it was the first step toward real growth. She arrived at the office that morning with a renewed sense of purpose. As she walked through the doors, she greeted her colleagues with a warmth she hadn't felt in days. She could still feel the lingering discomfort from her previous encounter with Alan, but she knew that the only way to move past it was to confront her own feelings head-on. After settling in at her desk, Clara quickly found herself lost in the rhythm of her work. But even as she typed away at her computer, her mind kept drifting back to the events of the previous day. She thought about Alan, his calm demeanor, his willingness to engage in the conversation without anger or defensiveness. Clara had been so quick to judge, but Alan had shown her that true strength didn't lie in holding on to preconceived notions. Strength came from understanding others, even when their views didn't align with your own. As the day wore on, Clara found herself wrestling with conflicting emotions. She had apologized to Alan, but the question remained, was it enough? Could one apology erase the harm caused by her assumptions? Clara didn't think so, but she also knew that it was a start, and that was all anyone could ask for, acknowledging the mistake and being willing to do better. She could spend the rest of her life regretting her actions, or she could choose to learn from them and move forward. It was clear which path she needed to take. The afternoon passed quickly, and Clara found herself facing another challenge. Alan had asked her to meet with him after work, something that Clara hadn't anticipated. She had assumed that the conversation with him was over, But now it seemed that there was more to be said. Clara felt a knot form in her stomach as she prepared herself for whatever was to come. The meeting took place in a quiet conference room, just down the hall from Clara's desk. Alan was already there when she arrived, seated across from a small table. His posture was relaxed, but there was an intensity in his gaze that Clara couldn't quite place. She had expected him to be angry, but instead, he seemed more thoughtful almost, as if he was giving her an opportunity to continue the conversation on his terms. "Clara, I've been thinking a lot about yesterday." Alan began, his voice calm but firm. "And I want to be clear, I wasn't upset with you personally. I think you were just reacting to the symbols I wear. But that's the thing about symbols, isn't it? They carry so much weight, but they don't always reflect the full picture." Clara nodded, her heart heavy. She had known that Alan wasn't angry with her, but hearing him articulated so clearly felt like a weight lifted off her shoulders. She had always been afraid of confrontation, but this was different. This was the kind of honest conversation that led to real growth. "I appreciate you saying that," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the turbulence she felt inside. "I've been doing a lot of thinking too, and I realize now that I let my assumptions cloud my judgment. I judged you based on a symbol without even considering who you were as a person." Alan leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. "We all do it," he said softly. "It's easy to judge based on what we see, especially when it doesn't fit our worldview. But the more we try to understand each other, the more we see how much we have in common, despite our differences." Clara felt a pang in her chest as she realized the truth in his words. She had spent so much of her life trying to fight against injustice, but in doing so, she had allowed her own biases to cloud her actions. She had been so sure of her beliefs, so certain that her perspective was the only valid one, that she had failed to see the humanity in others. It wasn't just about what people believed, it was about who they were as individuals and what they had to offer the world. "You're right," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been so focused on what I believe is right that I've failed to really see others for who they are. I've been judgmental, and I didn't even realize it until now." Alan gave her a reassuring smile, one that made Clara feel like she wasn't alone in her journey. "It's not easy to confront our own biases," he said, "but you're doing it, and that's the first step toward real change." Clara felt a surge of gratitude toward Alan. She had expected this conversation to be uncomfortable, but instead, it had become a moment of connection. She had thought that by apologizing to him, she would somehow make everything better. But now she understood that the apology was only the beginning. The real work lay in understanding, in learning to see beyond the symbols and the labels that separated people. "Thank you, Alan," Clara said, her voice filled with sincerity. "Thank you for giving me the chance to learn from my mistake. I don't expect everything to change overnight, but I want to be better. I want to be someone who listens, someone who sees others for who they truly are." Alan nodded, his smile warm and genuine. "That's all any of us can do, Clara. Keep learning, keep growing, and don't be afraid to make mistakes along the way." As Clara left the conference room, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in a long time. She had come to terms with her own shortcomings, and now she was ready to move forward with a new sense of purpose. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but Clara knew that she was on the right path, and for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful about the future. Clara didn't have all the answers, but she was no longer afraid to ask the difficult questions. She wasn't perfect, and she knew she would stumble again. But with the lessons she had learned from Alan and from herself, Clara was ready to take on the world with a new perspective, one that saw the humanity in everyone, regardless of their beliefs or background. Clara's journey was far from over. It had only just begun. The conversations with Alan and Grace had opened her eyes, but they had also left her with a responsibility to carry forward the lessons she had learned. As the days passed, Clara found herself continuously reflecting on her actions, on the things she had said, and on the ways in which her assumptions had shaped her behavior. The journey toward change was never linear, and there were moments of doubt, of frustration, and of questioning herself. But there were also moments of clarity, when she felt a sense of progress that told her she was on the right path. Clara walked into the office that Monday morning with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew it wasn't going to be easy. People don't change overnight, and neither would she. But the first step had been taken, and that was all she could ask for. As she walked through the office, she noticed the familiar faces of her colleagues, their voices filling the space. But Clara saw them differently now. She saw the stories behind the faces, the struggles, the experiences that had shaped each of them into who they were. She was more attuned to their humanity, more mindful of the way her words and actions affected them. As Clara sat down at her desk, she couldn't help but notice the lingering discomfort from the previous days. She had made an apology to Ellen, but there was still work to be done. She wasn't sure what that work would look like, but she knew it had to start with herself. It wasn't enough to simply apologize and walk away. She had to make a commitment to change, both in her personal life and in her professional one. Clara's first task of the day was a team meeting. It was a regular occurrence, one where the team gathered to discuss progress on current projects and share updates. But today, Clara felt different. She wasn't just showing up to the meeting as a member of the team. She was showing up as someone who was committed to learning, to listening, and to growing. As the meeting began, Clara found herself more engaged than usual. She listened carefully to her colleagues, taking note of the perspectives they shared. In the past, Clara had often dismissed certain viewpoints, assuming they were irrelevant or misguided. But today, she approached each idea with an open mind, considering the value in every contribution, no matter how small it seemed. During the meeting, Clara had an opportunity to speak. Her mind immediately flashed to the words she had said to Ellen in the conference room just days before. She knew that her words had caused harm, and that harm hadn't disappeared just because she had apologized. She needed to address it not just with Ellen, but with her team as well. I want to start by saying something that's been on my mind for a while now, Clara said, her voice calm but firm. I've been thinking a lot about how I behaved in the past, how I've let my own biases shape the way I interact with others. And I want to apologize for the times when I've been judgmental or dismissive of people's beliefs or appearances. It's not who I want to be, and it's not who I want to be going forward. Her colleagues looked up from their notes, some of them exchanging surprised glances. Clara could feel the weight of their eyes on her, but she didn't falter. She had made a mistake, and this was her chance to take responsibility. I've learned a lot recently about how easy it is to judge others based on surface-level things. She continued, but I've also learned that true growth comes from understanding, from listening, and from being willing to challenge our own assumptions. I want to do better not just as a colleague, but as a person. There was a brief silence as Clara's words sank in. Her colleagues weren't sure what to say at first. Some had known Clara for a long time and had seen her outspoken, confident demeanor in action. But today, they saw something different: a vulnerability, a humility, and a willingness to change. Finally, one of her teammates, Sarah, spoke up. Clara, I appreciate you saying that. It's not easy to admit when we've made mistakes. And I think we've all been guilty of making assumptions at some point. I think it's important that we keep having these conversations. Clara smiled, grateful for Sarah's words. Thank you, Sarah. I agree. It's not enough to just apologize. We need to keep talking, keep learning, and keep growing together. The meeting continued, but Clara felt a shift in the atmosphere. It was as though weight had been lifted, and the space felt lighter, more open. Her colleagues seemed more engaged, more willing to share their thoughts. And Clara realized that the simple act of taking responsibility for her actions had created an environment of trust and openness. It was a small but significant victory. Later that afternoon, Clara found herself walking to the break room. Her thoughts were still swirling from the meeting, but there was a sense of peace settling over her. She had taken the first step toward mending the relationships she had damaged. And she was starting to understand that the process of change wasn't about perfection. It was about consistency, about showing up and doing the work every single day. As she entered the break room, Clara was surprised to find Alan there, chatting with a few of her colleagues. He saw her standing by the door and offered a friendly smile. Clara, he greeted her, his tone warm. How are you today? Clara smiled back, feeling a mixture of gratitude and humility. Better, Alan, much better. I've been doing a lot of thinking, And I wanted to thank you again for the way you handled everything. I know I made some mistakes, but I'm trying to do better." Alan nodded, his expression softening. "I'm glad to hear that. And I want you to know that we all make mistakes. It's part of being human. What matters is how we move forward, and you're on the right path." Clara felt a rush of appreciation for Alan. He had been patient with her, understanding in a way that she hadn't expected. His response was kind, but it was also firm in its insistence on personal growth. Clara knew that this wasn't the end of the road, but it was an important step in the right direction. "I've been reflecting on everything," Clara said, her voice steady. "And I realized that change isn't just about what we say, it's about what we do. Day in and day out. I'm not perfect, but I'm committed to making the right choices from here on out." Alan smiled, a knowing look in his eyes. "That's all anyone can ask for, Clara. Just keep doing the work. It won't always be easy, but it will be worth it." As Clara left the break room, she felt a sense of quiet resolve. The lessons of the past few days had been difficult, but they had shaped her into someone more self-aware and more willing to change. She understood now that personal growth didn't happen in isolation. It happened in connection with others, with her community, and with herself. The journey wasn't about perfection, but about the effort to move forward with intention and understanding. That evening, as Clara sat at home, she thought about how far she had come. There was still work to be done, and she knew that her journey wasn't over. But she was no longer afraid of making mistakes. She was no longer afraid of change, because she had learned that it was in those moments of discomfort and self-reflection that true growth occurred. Clara's journey wasn't just about changing her opinions. It was about learning to listen, to understand, and to challenge the assumptions that held her back. And with each day, she was becoming a better version of herself. Not because she was perfect, but because she was willing to try. And that, Clara realized, was what truly mattered.